Good morning and welcome to the third part of our Financial Plan is Not Enough behavioral series. My name is Nick Andrew, and for those who don't know me, I head up Near Group Investments, and it is my pleasure to be your host today from a cold and rainy Cape Town. For those who didn't manage to watch the first two sessions, they have been recorded, and I encourage you to watch them as there are some real nuggets and great insights and learnings. Our purpose at Near Group Investments is to help you help your clients achieve their goals. You, as an advisor, play such an important role in times like this, and engaging appropriately with clients is so critical to them achieving successful financial outcomes. And that is why we decided to run this series, The Financial Plan is Not Enough, together with Neil Bage, Director of Behavioral Insights at BIQ, an award-winning fintech company based in the UK. BIQ has been set up specifically to help advisors understand their clients better so that they can communicate appropriately with each of them and ultimately help them achieve better financial outcomes. In the first of our three-part series on Monday, titled Being Human During Times of Uncertainty, Neil shared with us how we deal with uncertainty, complexity, and fear, and explored why what we say and how we say it to clients really matters. In the second module on Wednesday, titled What's Going On Inside Our Clients' Heads, Neil explored our capacity for thinking, both our heuristics and behavioral biases, but also conducted some short experiments to identify some of our own behavioral biases. Today, in the final session, titled Revealing Behavioral Characteristics and What This Means for Communication and Service, Neil will wrap up by exploring what this means for the way your clients navigate the world around them and what we as advisors can do to help. A reminder that if you have a question, please post it, and hopefully we'll be able to address a few at the end. Neil, thank you for some incredible insights in the first two modules, and we look forward to learning more today.
Thank you, Nick. It's my pleasure. It really is. It's been a great thing for me to be involved in. So just thank you for the invite in the first place. And I hope that everybody on the call is really taking some stuff away from this. Maybe not everything, but just little nuggets that they can then take into their practice and use with their clients. It's absolutely right. Today we wrap it all up. So I'm going to quickly do a recap of what I talked about on Wednesday. I know Nick has already done this. Just so we can all get on the same page, in essence, as to what I'm about to talk about today. So in part two, Nick's kind of covered this already. We looked at capacity for thinking, and our capacity for thinking is severely restricted. In other words, what we can think about and process at the same time isn't a great deal, and therefore has an impact on how we present information to clients. We often think that giving them lots and lots of information is the right thing to do. Actually, that's not the right thing to do based on the fact that we can't process that much information at the same time. We then looked at the two modes of thinking, system one thinking, which is quick and intuitive, and system two thinking, which is much more slow and deliberative. And if we were really to make amazingly great financial decisions all of the time, we would need to slow down our thinking and move into system two. But unfortunately, that's just not how we are wired to operate. And therefore, we typically fall into heuristical and biased thinking. And we played a few games. I'm going to try another one on you today. It's not really a game, but I'm going to do another interactive bit with you today that revealed certain behavioral biases and how that just manifests itself in you, let alone your clients. We looked at confirmation bias, we looked at salience, and we looked at over and under confidence. And then that led me into my kind of final slide of the last session, which was saying these behavioral biases, they don't all arrive independently like buses. They all arrive at the same time, kind of flooding your client's brain. And the phrase I used was, it's like a behavioral bias tsunami. These things just flood your client's brains and therefore have an impact on how they are making decisions. Now, before I actually start on today's content, I'm going to apologize. I owe everybody, especially those who attended Wednesday, a huge apology, because you will remember that when we were playing the confidence game, I asked you this question, but I never told you what the answer was. I was sitting yesterday on a call with somebody, and it just hit me. I thought, oh my, I asked them, the biceps femoris is the correct anatomical name for the tricep, true or false? And then I talked about how if you guessed and you said you were very confident, then you were showing overconfidence. But if you guessed and you said, I'm not really sure, then that was great. But I never told you what the answer was. So let me kind of right that wrong right now. The answer to that question is false. The biceps femoris muscle is another name for the hamstring muscle. So at least I've got that one out, and at least you know the answer to that question. And I do wonder how many of you after Wednesday just went onto Google to find the answer out for yourself. It would show you how engaged you were in the process, right? So that was all of part 2. So today I want to talk about revealing behavioral characteristics. And to do that, I'm actually going to go back to slide 46 from part 2. The presentation that I did on Wednesday. And I want to bring this back up to life, because what I would need to talk about today is the combination of behavioral biases. When a bias sits alongside another 1, 2, 3, or 4, and how they all unconsciously interact with each other to impact the decision a client then ends up making. And of course, all the way through this, from Monday to Wednesday to today, when I say how your clients make decisions, what I mean is just how human beings make decisions. So this kind of is relevant for every person on this call anyway, let alone the kind of planner-client relationship. So when we need to do this, we're going to look at 3 biases. And what happens when 3 biases come together? And the reason I've chosen these 3, confirmation bias, framing, and probability neglect, is that in the financial planning realm, these 3 often come together. They come together in the way clients interpret the information you present to them, and they come together in the way that the client is navigating the world, just absorbing information all of the time. But to make sure that, again, we are all on the same page, what I want to do is I just want to spend literally 5 minutes going through these 3 biases, telling you what they are, just so that we all know what we're talking about. Because when I tell you what they are and how they manifest themselves, it'll become a little bit easier to understand how they can very quickly and easily interact with each other. So confirmation bias, we played a game on Wednesday for confirmation bias. We went through the Wasson selection test, and that, you know, where the S and the 3, and which cards do you need to turn over. So confirmation bias, as a behavioral bias, known by psychologists as the mother of all behavioral biases, is where we search for or interpret information that is just consistent with our own beliefs, whilst at the same time ignoring evidence that could prove that we're wrong. And it is an incredibly powerful behavioral bias. And I'm going to come on to how your clients exhibit this more towards the end. But let me just give you another example. We did the Wasson selection test, but let me give you a real life example. Let me make an assumption that you believe that those people who have blue eyes are the most intelligent out of all eye colors. So you believe that blue-eyed people are the most intelligent, and you've got someone who's disagreeing with you. So you go online and you search for information to see if you can prove that you are right. I mean, therein lies the first issue, that we typically go online to find evidence that only supports the view that I already have. And actually what we type, let me use Google as the generic search engine here. What you type into Google is absolutely crucial if you want the right response delivered to you. Because what we typically do is we typically type in framed questions in the first place, and therefore the answer that comes back not only is framed in the context that we want it to be framed, but it also plays to confirmation bias. So if I go onto Google and I type in, are blue-eyed people the most intelligent? And I have done this, by the way, for this, not only for this talk, but I've done this for a paper I wrote on this very subject. What happens is you get a series of responses back, some studies, a lot of newspaper articles on the subject. And what you very, very quickly find is supporting evidence that shows you that historically brilliant people had blue eyes, like Marie Curie and Stephen Hawking. It shows you that in studies at school, blue-eyed people tend to outperform brown-eyed people. And now, if I'm kind of just playing to confirmation bias, that's all I need. I don't need any further information to prove that actually I've got my evidence. You know, Stephen Hawking, Marie Curie had blue eyes. They were amazing people, did amazing things. Blue-eyed people outperform brown-eyed people. Job done. I've got my evidence. But you haven't. You've only got evidence that supports your view. You need to see evidence that also says this may not be true. So in Google, what you really need to search for is eye color and intelligence, because this isn't framed. I haven't framed it by adding in a color. I'm just saying eye color and intelligence. So when you do this, what you get are numerous studies that have looked at everybody and every different eye color and looked at their academic achievements. They've looked at how successful they've been in the business world, etc., etc. There's a whole raft of kind of meta studies of this, but ultimately it shows you a much more robust sample set in relation to the question, including one study that ranks eye color and all various shades of eye color by typical IQ. And that is really interesting information, and blue isn't number one. Now, what's really interesting, of course, is if I was genuinely interested in finding out if blue people are the most intelligent, then what I would do is I would go into option 2. If I only wanted to confirm what I believed, I would put in option number 1. And option 1 is missing a ton of information. It's not telling me how other eye colors performed at school. And it's not telling me all of the other thousands and thousands of historically brilliant people who didn't have blue eyes. So everything gets framed and everything just plays to my confirmation bias. So understanding that is really important. Now, when you're dealing with your clients, they're not tips necessarily, but these are observations of how you and your clients may interact and what your client may bring into the meeting room. So with confirmation bias, there is a strong tendency for clients to turn up with preloaded views and opinions about a whole host of things. You know, that's how they navigate the world. And if they are starting to look at their financial plan or their retirement, that could include an opinion about what they believe to be the best investment solution and retirement plan for them. We see this time and time again around the world. If you are ill, people typically Google what their symptoms are and then go to a doctor and tell the doctor what's wrong with them. You know, it's an endemic. It's endemic of the times we live in. I can go onto Google and search for anything I want, and that could include what's the best retirement solution for me. And as an advisor, as a planner, one of the things we need to do is we need to challenge them in the right way about their views and their opinions. And we need to get to the bottom of the source of that view or opinion to figure out whether it really is an opinion or whether it is kind of rooted in fact and evidence. So these 3 things kind of happen in the majority of meetings that you have with your clients to varying degrees. But the last point is absolutely crucial. If you believe someone is exhibiting confirmation bias, then absolutely jump in and check the source of their bias. Framing bias is another powerful behavioral bias, and it's all about how people make a decision based on how information is presented to them as opposed to the facts themselves. Now, there is a really interesting study that happened in Australia, which I'm going to show you on the screen here. And basically what happened was a guy goes out onto a beach, and he has 2 big tarpaulin sheets laid down on the floor, and one says yes, one says no. And he says to people who are walking past, here's a shovel, pick up a shovel full of sand, and I'm going to ask you a question. If the answer is yes, put the sand on yes. If it's no, put it on no. And the question he asks people is, do you reckon you could retire on 70% of your current income? And by the end of the day, the yes pile is really high. The no pile is quite low down. The day after, he goes back and he repeats the exercise, except this time he asks people the opposite side or the other side of that question. He says to people, do you reckon you could retire on a 30% reduction in your current income? And what happens is the no pile is not high at all. Sorry, the yes pile is not high at all, but the no pile is really high. And that's because the second statement is framed in a more negative way than the first statement. But actually, when we're talking to clients, what we typically do sometimes is we will say, I have a load of information to give to the client. I'm just going to miss some out because it's just too long. And you choose which elements to miss out in your communication. Now, in doing that, what you're doing is you're playing to framing. And if people are susceptible to framing, they will read what you've written. And remember, presentation 2, the brain hasn't evolved to see pictures in kind of bits. It joins dots. It creates its own narrative. And that's what your clients will do. They will look at information that's not there and they will create their own narrative. And of course, it's invisible, so you won't know they are. So for those people who are very susceptible to framing, the question you need to ask them in this context is, can you retire on 70% of your current income, which, by the way, is a 30% reduction? And when you give them the full picture, then they are armed to make an informed decision. If you only give them part of this picture, then you are expecting them to fill in the gap. And they could fill in that gap with anything they want. So we need to make sure that the narrative we give people is complete in order to avoid framing bias. And one of the slides I use when I talk about framing to audiences all over the place is this one. It's an illustration that we had done for us back, 7 years ago now. And I always say to people, when you go to a supermarket and you look on the shelf and you'll see a frozen yogurt that says 80% fat free, you also need to remember that it contains 20% fat. But the shop would never sell any yogurts, I suspect, if the yogurt only said frozen yogurt contains 20% fat, because people would just be drawn away from that. So it's framed in a positive, but it doesn't tell you the full picture, because in this instance, why would it? Because it's painting a bad picture. So we always need to remember with framing that there is two sides to every story. And when we are asking clients to make important decisions, we need to make sure that both sides of that story are covered. So if we miss out information, clients will join the dots themselves. We need to make sure that, and especially given that framing is around negativity, so most people are susceptible to negatively framed biases. So we need to work with our clients to go beyond the emotion and not allow that negative frame to dominate the way that they are thinking. And the thing we need to always remember when we're producing documentation for clients, or whether we're even talking to clients, is that people have a natural default just to take information on face value. And we need to make sure that we are absolutely providing all the relevant information to them for them to make a decision. And the third and final bias I want to talk about today is probability neglect, or it's easier to understand if you flip that round, and it's basically where people neglect probability. They neglect to understand fully the chance of something happening. Now, there is possibly one of the most amazing studies that I've read, and it's in relation to probability neglect. And the key kind of area about probability neglect is it makes people violate what's called normative rules of decision making, which is where we weigh up the pros and the cons and just use that to reach a decision. Probability neglect kind of just throws that in the bin. Now, picture this scene. There is a room full of students, and the students have been separated into two groups. Group one come into the room and they get sat down and they get hooked up to a machine with little wires on their hands, and there's a button in front of them, and they are told this: we would like you to press the button. However, when you press that button, there is a 99% chance that you will receive an electric shock. Do you want to get out of the experiment? And if you do want to get out of the experiment, how much would you be willing to pay to get out of the experiment? And amongst all of the students, the average price they were willing to pay to get out of this experiment was $10. It's quite high, given that they typically either aren't paid for this, or when they are paid, they're paid pittance. So they were willing to pay $10 to get out of the experiment. Group two came in and they were hooked up to the machine and they were told the same thing, except they were told that when you press this button, there is a 1% chance that you will receive an electric shock. How much are you willing to pay to get out of the experiment? Now, if we just, before I press the button and reveal the answer here, just think about yourself. You know, if you was hooked up to a machine and you had to pay any money on that scale on the left-hand side to avoid a 1% chance of receiving an electric shock, how much would you pay? Well, the students involved in this experiment, on average, were willing to pay $7. Now, if you just look at the difference between the two, really, that isn't a great difference monetarily. That's not a great difference at all. You know, the first group, 100 people sit down, 99 of them are going to get a shock. In group 2, 100 people sit down and only one of them is. And yet, that group of people just viscerally think, wow, electrocution, no thanks, I'd rather get out of that. And yet they completely overplay the odds of it happening to them. They neglect the probability, because the probability of them receiving a shock is almost non-existent, only 1%. So probability neglect is a really powerful bias. And I mentioned in part 2, I think, about how people are quite happy to get into a car and drive down a motorway at 70, 80 miles an hour and completely feel invincible and don't even think about their own mortality. And yet the second they get in an airplane to fly abroad on holiday, they absolutely think about their own mortality. And yet the statistical evidence categorically shows us that the chance of us being in an accident in a car significantly outweighs the chance of being in an accident in an airplane. And that also is probability neglect. So in relation to this bias, I'm going to play a really quick game with you. Let's look at these 5 things. And I've adapted this for the South African market. So these are not in order at all. These are randomly ordered at this moment in time. And what I would like you to do is I would like you to just think about the 5 of them and put them in the order that you think from most likely to happen down to least likely to happen. Let me explain them all. So for those who don't play poker, a royal flush is the best hand you can get in poker. And what are the odds of you receiving a royal flush in the first 5 cards that you were dealt in a game of poker? What's the chance of you winning the national lottery? And I've used the South African national lottery as my statistic here. What's the chance of you being struck by lightning, being seriously injured or unfortunately killed by something falling from the sky? And what's the chance of you living to 100? I've been talking about it, so you've been thinking about it. Everybody will have an answer, I'm assuming, of what they believe out of those 5 is the most likely to happen. It's really interesting to how people compute this information, because some of those things are familiar, some are unfamiliar. When it's familiar, we tend to overinflate. When it's unfamiliar, we tend to downplay. This is the real order that they should be in. Let me just bring in the statistic just to kind of complete the picture. So statistically, given medical advances and drug treatments, etc., coronavirus aside, there is a 1 in 3 chance that everybody on this call will live to the age of 100. Caveat, caveat, caveat. But statistically, there is a 1 in 3 chance of living to 100. There is a 1 in 650,000 chance of getting the best hand in poker with the first cards that you get. And then down to the very bottom, there is the chance of winning the national lottery. Now, what's interesting in putting this screen together and using a South African statistic is I deleted a UK statistic, and the chance of winning the national lottery in the UK is 1 in 45 million. So twice as unlikely and a bit than it is in the South African national lottery. But what's interesting when you talk to people about this is it's not very often that anybody can get all 5 in the right order, because computing probability isn't the easiest thing for us to do, which is why it tends to get neglected. So with probability neglect, always remember that your financial planning conversations are about unknown outcomes, and therefore they are about the chance of things happening. And don't allow probability neglect, in other words, a misunderstanding of the chance of something happening, be the dominant factor in a conversation. Remember that low probability events are easily and often overemphasized and vice versa. So high probability events are often underemphasized. And that's quite important when you're talking to clients in particular about risk taking. And that kind of leads on to that last final point, which is when we're talking about risk with clients. And this is something I very, very rarely see in the UK. Make sure that when we talk about risk with clients, that they understand the difference between absolute risk and relative risk. Those two things are different, and they have statistically different outputs. So when we're talking to clients about risk, they need to understand that, because this plays to probability neglect too. So 3 kind of tips, suggestions, if you like. So there's 9 on the screen, and I've only talked about 3 behavioral biases. There are hundreds of them. So you could, in theory, have hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of tips. Or more to the point, all of these 9 boxes are what is going on at any point in time inside your clients' heads. They are invisible to the world. And that's not all, of course, because we know this, because this is part 3 of a 3-part presentation. We know that that's not all that's going on. We also know that they have limited capacity for thinking, that they have system 1, system 2 fighting with each other to be dominant, where system 1 typically wins, which means intuition, quick thinking. They have to deal with complexity, anxiety, fear, worry, and stress. So all of this, as well as all of that, is going on invisibly inside your clients' heads, which is why when you we simplify this by revealing, instead of individual behavioral biases, as well as individual behavioral biases, behavioral characteristics, which means we can take 3 kind of behaviors, confirmation bias, framing, and probability neglect, and we can put them together, looking at their interplay between each other. And we know that what this does is this has an impact on a person's judgment. These 3 biases combine to impact how a person perceives and therefore reacts to news, views, and information. So are they more persuadable, meaning they see something on the TV and they think, oh my God, I've got to do something, and they don't pause and kind of dig deeper? Or are they more discerning, meaning they see something on the news and they go, I need to know more. I need to dig more, because if I need to make a choice, I'm not making it on what they've just said. That discerning kind of part of your judgment personality allows you to jump more into system 2 than into system 1. Now, what's really interesting here is when we start to look at this in relationship to your clients. So let me give you an example here. We have 2 clients, and for all intents and purposes, these 2 clients are the same, really. They are both female. They are both married. They both have 3 children. They are both employed. They both earn 750,000 Rand. They both have a net worth of 10 million, and both are high risk on a risk questionnaire. Now, in South Africa, I'm not wholly sure. I'm very sure about in the UK how financial planners go about segmenting clients within their business. So I'm going to use a very rudimentary segmentation suggestion here and say that what you may do with these 2 clients is you may look at their demographic makeup and assume or even just decide, to put them into your gold group. These are 3 really good clients, great net worth, great earnings. I'm going to put them, they become my gold client. And you may even deliver a different service model to this segment of your client bank. That's absolutely fine. And that is a very reliable and well-known methodology for segmenting clients. But it misses out the beauty of those 2 women, those 2 clients, being human beings and navigating the world in their own unique way. Excuse me. So when we jump back into judgment, if on one side of the scale we have persuadable, meaning when I see the news I'm going to just react, or on the other end I have discerning, it is absolutely feasible that those 2 clients, whilst they have the same demographic makeup, are navigating the world in their own way. They are taking in information in their own way. They are reaching decisions in their own way. Their capacity for thinking, their use of system 1, system 2, the amount of fear, anxiety and worry that they exhibit will be unique to them. And therefore, kind of putting them into a segmentation model where they get the same service standard, they get the same documentation, etc., etc. And I'm only illustrating a point here, actually misses out on all of the beautiful things that makes them who they are. Now, these two clients, for me, if it was my financial planning business, they would be very different people. The stuff along the bottom, it's great to know, right? The know your client kind of fact find stuff. Of course, I need to know this stuff. And it's relevant to a degree to me as a business owner. But how I help these two people on their journey, how I help them with the design and implementation of their financial plan will be completely different. And I can look at this across judgment, but I can also look at this across another behavioral characteristic, which is composure. So judgment goes from persuadable to discerning. A person's composure goes from hesitant, in other words, more nervous, through to measured or calmer. And these two clients, yes, they sit on here from an illustrative perspective and they are remarkably similar. So the purple client is both discerning and a lot more measured when she's making decisions. The blue client is really persuadable and can be quite a nervous investor. And yet, what we tend to do is we tend to look at them across the piece because we have a demographic profile and say they are the same client. My contention today, my challenge to you today, is to think of your clients in a behavioral context and then alongside your segmentation model and see if you can answer that question. Are they the same person? And of course, I've only chosen two people here. When you start mapping all of your clients to this scale, you start to see what we would classify as anomalies in their behavioral characteristics and their behavioral makeup, where one bias is pushing another or opposing another and causing conflicts. And you would find here, for example, that whilst the yellow client here is very persuadable, from an emotional perspective, she's also very calm and measured. Whereas the green client at the top, she may slow down and think about things and make sure she has all of the evidence, but she is highly emotional when she makes financial decisions. And just understanding those two things and BIQ, and I'm going to talk about this very quickly at the end. BIQ delivered multiple characteristics, and just understanding these two changes everything. It changes how I speak to them, when I speak to them, and what I speak to them about. So just to reiterate what I've said, I'd like you to do a little exercise, and this isn't for now. This is for post this talk today. But I hope, with good faith, that you do this because it may be really revealing to you. So after today's session, I would like you to just go away and I would like you to think or even find in your database two clients who you would classify as the same, being in the same segment, based on the criteria that you have defined equals a particular segment of your client bank. And I would like you to think of the interactions that you've had with those clients. I'd like you to think about the way that they answer your questions. I'd like you to think about how they engage with you. And I'd like you to think about how they react emotionally to situations. This could be any two clients, by the way, male, female, a male and a woman and a woman. I really don't care, just two clients. But I'm also going to give you a big caveat emptor here. Don't go into this exercise with confirmation bias. Don't go into this exercise thinking, I know my clients and I think the segmentation model I have is correct, and only try and find two clients that confirm that view. The best idea here is to go into a segment and genuinely randomly pick two clients without even looking if that's even possible, so that you aren't picking two clients who are the same, who when you interact with them are the same, because all you'll do then is you'll just go, Neil was completely wrong, and I might be wrong, by the way, but you'll just go, Neil is wrong, I'm right, therefore what I'm doing is absolutely correct. And we can't learn from that. So all my suggestion, my wholeheartedly kind suggestion is kind of take this exercise after this event and at least see if that's true. If it's true, great. But if it's not true, it gives you an insight into how clients can be completely different, and yet we may have miscategorized them only because with all good intentions, we've done that using their demographic profile. So the question that you need to answer at the end of this exercise is, should these people be in the segment that I've put them into or not? Excuse me. And the reason why I talk about this a great deal is because we have a belief. And this is based not just on my confirmation bias or any other bias I have coursing through my veins. This is based on empirical research that we've carried out over the last 5 years, independent research. And what we find from that is when you segment clients by behavioral characteristic, it better reflects not only the client, but it better reflects your relationship with them. It kind of changes how you engage with them completely. It changes your verbal communication. In other words, it changes the words that you need to use in order to make sure that the client fully understands what you're saying to them. And verbal communication, by the way, I would also include in this, not necessarily verbal communication, but also your listening skills. Because if a person is coming to you and they are highly persuadable and they are full of confirmation bias and they are emotional, actually what you don't need at that point in time is to be just speaking. You need to sit back and just listen and allow them to speak, but you need to be taking all of the little nuggets, that kind of revealing biased thinking, and kind of store them ready for your part in that conversation. So our verbal communication, and it says it at the very bottom, ironically, on that slide, it is all about who do we speak to, when do we speak to them, and what do we speak to them about. And those three things change the narrative, because if you're saying to a gold segment where everybody's in there by demographic profile, I'm going to speak to them all right now about the fact that the markets have fallen and they should be fine and not to worry. That's I've seen that happen in the UK several times, that example. Well, what you're neglecting to factor in is that within that gold segment, a group of those people will be highly emotional and persuadable and will listen to what you say, and you're saying don't panic, and we'll do the complete opposite and we'll start to panic. There will be people who will go, yeah, completely fine, I'm cool with this, and that's great. But so which is why kind of segmenting by behavior gives you an insight and allows you to know who to speak to, when to speak to them, and what to speak to them about. And this filters through to your written communication. When you're producing documentation, I mentioned this in part number 2, when you're producing your written communication, make sure that you don't miss something out just for expediency or because you think it will make reading the document easier. Be really, really conscious about what you're missing out, and don't just say, I'm not going to put that in. If you want to extract something from your written communications, look at it in the correct context and see if it genuinely completes the story, or whether by taking it out, you are leaving gaps that the client will fill in for themselves. I see this time and time again across UK financial planning firms I work with, that and it's done with all of the right intent, by the way. It's not done with any kind of malice at all. It's done with completely the right intent. But they say, this document feels a bit too long. I'm just going to take out this entire paragraph because if I jump from paragraph 1 to 3, it's shorter. People's attention spans are always short, so I need to get to the point, and I'm going to take this out. But by taking it out, you have just created a void that the client will read that document and they will put their own information in. And then when you say, can you make a decision off the back of this? They'll say yes, but it's actually not based now on the information you presented. It's a mixture between your information and the story they've created in their own heads. And of course, this then goes back to finally to your engagement strategy. When markets do fall, and I'm sorry for keep using the same example, but when markets do fall, you don't need to, verbally or even from a written perspective, communicate with every client with the same message. There are some people in your client bank who you would need to absolutely communicate with immediately and say to them, I know what's going on and I know how you're feeling, and I just want to make sure everything's all right. And there are other people who you just need to say, I know the markets are a little bit volatile. Your plan factors this in, and all you're doing with them is you're giving them the comfort in the decisions that they are absolutely aware of and are happy to keep on track with. The other group of people are the ones who you need to kind of metaphorically put your arm around and hold their hand and guide them through those volatile times. And like I said, and I've said like 8 times now, I think, segmenting clients by gold, silver, and bronze just doesn't allow us to achieve that sense, that personalization, that intimacy, if you like, of understanding the clients and what they're going through, and therefore how they are navigating the world around them. And this allows us to do something which I think plays to the unique human-to-human relationship. In the very first session I did on Monday, I believe that they've all joined into one now, but I believe that I said, and if I didn't, I'm saying it now anyway, the thing for me about the way that the world is evolving with robo-advice and digital advisors popping up here, there, and everywhere, the one thing the computer will never be able to replace is the human-to-human relationship. We've spent 5 million years becoming finely attuned machines at picking up on the subtle cues of another human being. You know when somebody's not okay by just looking at them. We just sense this stuff, and our senses are so finely tuned to interact with other human beings. A computer would never be able to mirror that. A computer would never be able to look at a client and say, are you okay? And this type of interaction allows us to factor in empathy into our conversations. And when we can be empathetic with people, and whether that's cognitive empathy or effective empathy, in other words, just knowing what someone's feeling, or effective empathy, feeling what they're feeling, when you bring those two things into a conversation, it becomes incredibly human. And that is what we've spent all of this time developing developing as a species. We are fine-tuned machines when it comes to that. So the human-to-human relationship for me trumps everything that has come before us and will come after us. I don't think a machine can ever replace that. But what machines can do, and this is the work that BIQ have done, is you can try and make the invisible visible. You can start giving people tools and access to information. And from a client's perspective, you can give them information and access to tools that deliver self-awareness. It allows them to know themselves. It allows them to reveal biases in themselves and know what that means for them and how they are navigating the world. And tools that advisors can use to not only know your client, and I don't mean that tick box regulatory exercise, I mean know your client. And it gives evidence-based behavioral insights on which to base everything that I've talked about so far. It allows you to segment clients by behavior based on evidence. It allows me to know, because it's evidence-based, who to speak to, when to speak to them, and what to speak to them about. And that is the beauty of behavioral characteristics. It's about taking all of the behavioral biases that course through our veins and saying, that's a lot of information to compute, and saying, actually, I can put them together into behavioral characteristic groups, and then I can see how that impacts a person's judgment, decision management, composure, for example. And that is what changes the narrative. And my final suggestion to you is to, one, go away and do that little exercise, but go away and think about how behavioral insight could be added into your businesses to enhance the already amazing service that you already deliver to your clients, and how that could change the dynamic, the relationship between you and them. Whew. And breathe. So we're coming up to the end, but I wanted to just do this because I think it gives us a great, it's just a great record of everything we've covered off over the last 3 hours that we've spent together, and across 3 sessions, session 1, session 2, and session 3. So in session 1, the big recap. In session 1, we looked at human evolution and how we've spent years evolving as a species And the things that kind of always live with us, continue to live with us, that impact the way we navigate the world are uncertainty, anxiety, complexity, and fear. And how our psychology and our biology can often play against us when we're trying to make decisions, in particular when things like fight and flight kick in and our prefrontal cortex is inhibited when we're trying to make important decisions. When we are faced with situations of anxiety and uncertainty and fear, certain behavioral biases can get supercharged and can become the dominant way that people arrive at important decisions. And that's why the role of the advisor should also be one of co-pilot, to work with clients to help them kind of cut through the noise of the world, and when needed, to tell them to not look on social media for their fact-based evidence. We looked at capacity for thinking and how that is severely limited, especially when we come to make decisions. And we looked at our two modes of thinking, system 1 and system 2, and how that can lead to heuristics, shortcuts or rules of thumb, or behavioral biases. And we've covered off several of them in these 3 sessions. We played a few games together, which I hope you found enjoyable, and that kind of led on to a natural progression in the narrative of what happens then when biases collide. What happens when confirmation bias, probability neglect, and framing all arrive at exactly the same time. And we've talked today how they come together to create behavioral characteristics. And the examples I gave today were judgment and composure. And we took that and looked at how that can be then used to enhance the already amazing service that you have with your clients, but maybe thinking about adopting a model of client segmentation by behavior, because that allows us then to know who to speak to, when to speak to them, and what to speak to them about. And that has a fundamental impact in a positive way on all of your client engagement from that point forward using behavioral insight. So my parting thoughts. We need to remember that when biases collide, things get really interesting and insightful. And our job really is to work with a client to make those invisible factors that are driving their decisions visible, and use those visible insights as part of the financial planning journey. But we also need to just remember, and I say this time and time again, that our behavioral biases, our heuristics, they're not bad and they're not good. They shouldn't be seen as bad or good. They should just be seen as human being factors that make us who we are. They give us all the richness and the beauty and the color that make us us. And that's the thing that I love, the reason why I've worked with human behavior for so long, because that's what I love about humans. Everybody's unique and everybody sees and navigates the world in their own unique way. And we need to remember that. And that's why segmenting clients by behavior just makes infinite sense, to me at least. We need to always remember that when a client comes to see us, there is a ton of stuff going on inside their head, which is hidden from view. And a part of the role of the financial planner, outside of being a financial planner, is helping clients understand this and helping them cut through that noise to arrive at a informed, evidence-based decision. And the best way to do this is to augment that entire process with behavioral insight, because then you get to know the human. Then you get to really know who is in your room with you and how you can continually interact with them to ultimately deliver financial well-being. That's it for me, the end of part 3. I think I finished on time. I'm going to hand back to Nick.
Great. Thank you very much, Neil. We've got a range of questions. I don't think we're going to be able to get through them. That was like some amazing insights, really fascinating. So I'm going to start with a couple of them. And the first one was, can clients with knowledge change any of their biases as they get information, or do you retain the bias and you just learn to be able to manage it better?
It's more the latter than the former. So with knowledge, so I'm going to use me as an example, because I think that through my studies and through the work I do, that I have a really great understanding of behavioral bias in me. And yet I still find myself falling for things and reacting in a way that goes completely against what the way that I really want to react and process information, for example. So I'm still an emotional human being, and my emotions are very dominant. So I react, and then my brain kicks in and says, Neil, what are you doing? And I tend to slow down at that point. But it's more of a knee-jerk reaction that kicks that whole process off. So being aware of my biases allows me to go, no, Neil, look for more information. Don't just look at what somebody has said on Twitter and reacting to it, because you do. I know that I have confirmation bias and framing and anchoring and all of these things, and I know I'm emotional. And I see one thing that some idiot has posted on Twitter, and I kind of found myself boiling inside because my emotion gets triggered first and foremost. And then my bias goes, what's he talking about? Oh, I can't believe he said that. And then I go, oh, hang on. Slow down, Neil. Let me see if there's truth in this. And then I revert back to kind of understanding that I need to slow down and I need to look for more evidence and more information. So being aware of them allows us to recognize when they are becoming dominant, and that's a great thing. But will they change over time? I think your natural biases are there and they will always be there. We just need to understand how we can control and manage them better.
Great. And then we've got another interesting one which related to the segmentation. So I guess one of the things that it sounds like you're recommending is to segment one's base more on behavioral side. Mm-hmm. But just to the whole difference where one says bronze, silver, gold. Is there a behavioral challenge if clients know that they've been allocated to one of those categories? Or what is the best way to segment clients? Should they know where they're segmented, or is it an internal classification?
No, it's an internal classification. I think but actually, Nick, I've said that, and then I'm going to completely counter what I've just said. It's an internal classification if you go gold, silver, bronze. If you put clients into groups that are kind of arbitrary based on demographic profiling, then I think you should always have them as an internal solution. Never ever tell the client which segment they're in. I think that's and it's a personal opinion here. So it's not based on fact or evidence. It's an opinion. My opinion is that is a recipe for disaster, because when somebody finds out that all of the money that they've worked all of their life to earn is invested, and they're a bronze client, it can come across, I think, as a little bit of a slap in the face, I think. Whereas behavioral characteristics are all about the human being. So we produce, for example, at BIQ, on the investing side, we produce 8 investing personas, which are 8 segments of clients. And they aren't saying to somebody that they're wrong or they're right. They're saying this is your segment based on you and your human behavioral characteristics. And what I found in the UK is the advisors I work with who use our systems are starting to use that data and have actually asked us to develop a reporting system that gives the client their persona name, which in other words, their segment, and how their behaviors are made up and what that means for them in relation to decision making. So the advisors in the UK I work with are starting to see it as a positive way to segment, because it's not a gold, bronze, silver methodology. It's this is who you are as a human being, and this is just a group of people who are the same as you. And within that group, there will be people who are claiming benefits and people who are multimillionaires. So it's you're not being judged by your wealth or your social status or your demographic profile. You're being categorized by your human characteristics. And I think people so far have seen that as a real positive step.
Great. And I think we've got time for one more question. And this is a football related, clearly either a Liverpool or Man U fan, saying with Liverpool recently winning the Premier League, and their fans going around comparing victories with Man U, is this a combination of 3 biases that you've mentioned, with no mention of the period, just celebrating the recent victory?
Of course it is. There's a whole bunch of behavioural biases at play there. They are framing their narrative, of course, with a very specific event. They aren't looking at all of the, they aren't looking at all of the times when they were beaten. They're only looking at in isolation at the certain times when they won. So framing is one of them. Confirmation bias, of course, is playing out in that regard. But there are several other biases at play there. And you see this, by the way, if you look at the way that people are processing the information about the pandemic lockdown. Some people here are government ministers saying, this is the rule that I need everybody to abide by. And there are certain pockets of the population who will interpret that rule and that information how they want to interpret it based for their own good and their own gain. And that's a very remarkably similar set of behavioral biases that drive that behavior to this example. It's really interesting when something like this happens, because we very quickly, let me look at the time. Let me tell you a quick behavioral bias. There's a bias called the peak end rule. And the peak end rule bias basically says that we remember an event based how we felt at its peak and how we felt at the end. So what you end up with is, given the pandemic, if at its peak you felt pretty terrible, but then when the lockdown was released, everybody went out and partied, people will tend to remember in years to come this period of time based on the peak and the end. And that's the same as, football, Liverpool and Man United. Liverpool's had a different season, right? But typically what happens is football fans remember how they felt at the end when they've won the championship, and not necessarily how they felt at every game through the season. So they remember its peak when they thought, oh my God, we're going to win the league, and they will remember the end. And that distorts the underlying data that actually makes up the entire season. And that's so there's a number of biases, Nick, at play, but absolutely well done for spotting that framing, especially in confirmation bias, are very, very dominant at the moment.
Well, thank you very much, Neil. I think that's all that we've got time for today. So many thanks to everyone who's joined us. Since the lockdown, we've made it a key priority to communicate with you around the views, the positioning, the insights of our best of breed managers, economists, political analysts, behavioral experts, and have held more than 30 Insights at 10 sessions. These have the purpose of keeping you up to date and informed so you're able to engage better with your clients. Thank you for your attendance. It's been remarkable. We've had more than 3,000 clients who've attended the sessions this week alone. And if you missed any, they are available on our website, on YouTube, on our YouTube channel, and podcast channels on Apple, Google, or Spotify. We've also had some queries around CPD points. They are available if you logged in. If you came in anonymously, please contact your Ned Group Investments representative and we will attempt to make a plan. We welcome any feedback on how we can improve these or what content you would find most useful. We constantly learning and trying to improve this service. Please do look out for invites to quarterly feedback sessions, which will begin early in July in the next fortnight with our best of breed managers, both locally and globally. Once again, thank you very much for joining us. Hope you have a wonderful day. Keep safe.